we're just ignoring it and watching that problem pile up, as we're watching the debt problem pile up, as we're watching the governance crisis pile up, as we're watching the weakness in our defence piling up. And to answer your first question, at some point when these issues all come to the fore, we've got a failed state on our hands, and life is going to get very, very unpleasant for people.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, former government advisor James Price says Britain is in danger of becoming a failed state. James explains how the Blob or deep state prevents any real political change.
This should make people furious, right? And this is why when you see the different Prime Minister comes in and out and these different teams and stuff, why not as much changes as you would hope that it might. If things go wrong, the only people that get fired are the ministers at the very top. Maybe a naughty special advisor every now and then for getting caught leaking something. Right? But it's almost impossible to be fired from the civil service. You just get moved on to a different job, probably promoted into a different role.
James talks about the cultural damage caused by mass immigration.
We have to then start being more robust on our values and our ways of life, and only having people here who love this place. Roger Scruton would call oikophilia, a love of place. If you don't have that, then you can't stay. And that starts with deportations of people. And increasingly, I think we're going to have to start having really unpleasant, illiberal conversations, certainly illiberal to today's soft mindset, about what that entails in order to keep ourselves safer.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with commentator and former government advisor James Price. James, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to talk to you about the wider question of, is Britain becoming a failed state? I think there's a lot of things that can feed into this, but it seems a good starting point is JD Vance's recent speech in Munich. I mean, what was said there and why was it important?
It was quite a shot across the broadsides, wasn't it? I think people were expecting for him to say, Europe needs to spend more on defence and, a bit of a token nod to woke and all that kind of stuff. They were ready for a bit of a telling off. I don't think anybody expected it to be quite as blistering and forthright as it was. And I have to say, I was a big supporter of everything he said almost. I think it's a wake-up call has been long overdue. And whilst some previous American administrations have talked about European states, the EU itself, and the UK, both inside and outside the EU, they've talked about the need to spend more and free riding and all this kind of stuff. And the Europeans just kind of went, oh yeah, that's all just bluster. We can get away with not spending enough on our own continent's defence and keep spending it on not getting serious about welfare bills, not getting serious about debt, interest payments and things like that, all these sorts of problems, and it will never become a problem because America will always look after us.
Yeah.
When you look back now, in the kind of moments after that Vance speech, that always is a ridiculous way to think about stuff, especially the most serious topic of all, the defence of the realm, or realms in this case. So I thought it was incredibly welcome and long overdue. My fiancée is American. She comes from the Midwest in the United States. When you go to the Midwest, Ukraine feels a long way away, right? It feels very, very far off. Everything, frankly, feels quite far off when you're far away from either sea to shining sea. And whilst I do think America has a role to play, a big role, an outsized role in global security and global defence, I think the Pax Americana is one of the best things that's ever happened to the world and keeping peace generally. It is ridiculous to expect these American taxpayers who don't have the kind of luxurious social welfare kind of states that we've got here in Europe, for these people to be shelling out for defence of our continent when we're not even willing to match it and do our bit.
What message did you feel America was sending for the Vice President to come here and give that speech in that setting?
Yeah, well, people said, he's attacking Europe. I think it's exactly the opposite. I think Vance is a young guy with a young family, unlike many politicians here in Europe. I suppose unlike his boss as well, to be fair. But, he's got a long life ahead of him. He's obviously got big ambitions. And he looks over at Europe, who we're now calling America an unreliable partner. But he's seen the Europeans as unreliable partners, right? These are people who've not been spending what they promised they would spend in terms of GDP on defence. That is the kind of NATO target, at least. He's seeing all of this. He's also seen, and he was, I think, wise to admit this, that we have caught an earlier American infection in the terms of the kind of woke and all of that sort of nonsense, right? He admitted as much of that. He said, look, we've started a lot of this, but we're under new management now, and just as we're shedding all of this kind of woke nonsense that has corrupted, in his view, everything in American society, the military all the way through, you guys in Europe have got to stop this as well. And you've also got to stop things that they're attempting to stop themselves, like the kind of deleterious, shall we call it, effects of mass migration. Because at least American mass migration has for a long time been kind of Hispanic Christians who had a vague sense of capitalism and Christian ethics and things. That's not so bad compared to the kinds of mass migration that have been affecting Europe so negatively in recent years. And of course that censorship point, Vance very tied in with a lot of the kind of American tech bros, and the way that, say, the Digital Services Act from the EU attacks mostly American big tech firms. That's that kind of provocation at a time when America is also paying most of the way for your defence of your own continent was a toxic combo. So I think that far from it being an attack on Europe, I think it's exactly what a friend should do when you're being out of line, when you're not paying your own way, for a friend to stand up and say, right, you've got to sort yourself out or else I'm going to sort you out for you. Yeah. I thought that was fair enough.
I mean, Vance did kind of say the unsayable, that mass immigration wasn't voted for, and people are concerned about the impact it's having. I mean, he basically questioned the elite luxury beliefs. So were you surprised that he did that?
I was overjoyed that he said it as it was, right? It is this kind of, I've written in a piece recently, it was the kind of great omerta that we're not doing this. I mean, just look, we're talking now just in the wake of the German election results coming out, where the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, have got a quarter of all of the seats, almost a quarter of the votes as well. Yeah. Okay, there's some nasty stuff in there in the underbelly of what they've been saying, but their fundamental point is about the deleterious effects of mass migration on Germany. That cannot be denied. Right? It cannot be denied. The number of attacks that you've had, and I think most emblematic was when that, I think it was a bogus asylum seeker, started stabbing somebody in the street. Person starts fighting back. Police officer comes running up and tackles the guy who had been attacked. And as he's attacking him to the ground, said asylum seeker goes up to the police officer and slashes his throat and kills him. Right? If that had been made up, you would say that metaphor was too on the nose. But that's what's been happening in Germany. There, in the wake of Vance's speech, on either side of it, there was an anti-Semitic attack in Greece, where two people were speaking in Hebrew and someone screamed Allahu Akbar and attacked them. And I wrote there, I think, something like what he lacked in originality of catchphrase he made up for in brutality. There was an attack in France, a grenade attack in Grenoble. There were attacks all over the continent. It happens again and again and again. Look at Sweden. Yeah. But 30 grenade attacks in the month of January. The government coming out and saying, we're not in control anymore. And we're not waking up at this point. Vance's security detail were probably breathing a sigh of relief when Air Force Two's wheels got off the ground and left Europe. That's where we've got to. And if it takes an American vice president coming over like a kind of angry Roman proconsul to come and remonstrate with a naughty province, letting too many Gauls in or whatever, then that's what we need. Because at the moment, our leadership across most European countries are just not facing up to the long-term negative consequences of the mass migration, of the censorship as well, and the kind of other woke stuff that we've also caught from the Americans.
So also there's the grooming gangs, which came into the limelight again recently, again because Americans kind of pushing it out there and saying, look at this. I mean, do you think it's kind of enough? I mean, it's one thing to talk about something, but things actually need to be done to solve the problem.
Yeah, they're talking about it, you're right, isn't enough. And we'll come down to the way that actually the state in the UK operates. It is only done by huge amounts of a kind of acute force in the media, because that's all politicians seem to care about. But I do think that the grooming gangs point is something that, if this is a harbinger of the way that politics is going to be done, then so be it. Because, there are so many people who ignored this issue, and we know ignored it because the sensitivities around it. So you have police officers saying things like, oh, we didn't want to investigate it too much because we didn't want to look racist. We noticed that almost all of the people involved were Pakistani men or men from Pakistani origin. We didn't want to say that because that would cause a big problem. Well, that ain't good enough anymore when you've got an X or Twitter, as it used to be called, that is run by someone who doesn't care about these sorts of things and is happy to throw, in this case, metaphorical grenades into this issue. Great people like Charlie Peters, who've been working on this for a long time, say that the survivors of these disgusting, and I don't like calling them grooming gangs, we should call them, paedophilic rape gangs, because that's often what they were, and we shouldn't be allowed to shy away from the realities of these things. I think a lot of the grooming gang stuff came about because of an otherwise very sound, smart man, a good friend of mine called Fraser Nelson, who was until recently the editor of The Spectator magazine. his final piece for the Telegraph, when he also left there, was to say that Britain has been this amazing integration success story. He got loads of pushback on the newly liberated X, formerly Twitter, of people saying, God, if that's an integration success story, I would hate to see what a failure looks like. And a very smart young writer called Sam Bidwell, I think, was the person who got picked up first by Elon Musk on this and retweeted and saw his kind of interactions with Fraser, calling him out to some extent on the various problems that we've got. And that interaction was what got this stuff back in the headlines.
Yeah.
And, we in Britain, we'd heard about this, we knew about it, but often we thought it was in these sort of small northern towns that don't get a lot of attention. We, conveniently forgotten that it was also happening in places like Oxford, with the fanciest and best and one of the oldest universities in the world, happening in the outskirts there. And we just kind of moved on because it was seen as being low status, an issue to talk about. It wasn't the sort of thing that people wanted to talk about at nice dinner parties. If you were seen talking about it, you wouldn't be invited to those nice gatherings. And yeah, just that kind of low class thing. You've got a generation of people now given a voice and a platform by Twitter, in particular, who don't care about this because they see that things are getting so bad so fast over the course of their lifetimes. This guy Sam Bidwell, people should check out. He's 10 years younger than I am, and therefore he's got a lot longer still, even in the UK, and he's seeing the way this stuff is going. He's seeing how much worse things are going to get. What's the point in keeping your nose clean so you can get yourself a kind of nondescript city job and try and get yourself a little box that you can buy in Zone 5 once upon a time if your country is falling apart all around you? People are emboldened to speak up in times of crisis like this.
It's almost like the way we kind of receive our media and receive our information is changing, because this didn't come about, as you say, from some kind of mainstream media breaking the story. It was people like Sam Bidwell.
Yeah, and I think that's a really exciting thing. I think it's a problem because the gatekeepers have all been removed, and therefore there will be fake news and all this kind of stuff coming along. I mean, there was always fake news, of course, right? There were always, you go back 2,000 years and Roman senators were making up horrible slurs about each other. Oh, you slept with this animal, you slept with that, all that kind of stuff has been going on all the time, throwing that kind of mud back and forth at each other. So this idea that misinformation and disinformation are new, I think those terms kind of came about largely for American liberal elites who didn't want to believe that Trump could have won in 2016 via legitimate means. But the gatekeepers being destroyed means that everything is sort of up to play for now. And you get young lads who are willing to speak the truth on Twitter, then getting amplified, and that kind of supercharges these discussions. There's a lot of talk at the moment about British soft power, right? Oh, we've got to give away the Chagos Islands, we've got to do this and that because of our soft power. Well, all Britain's soft power is these days, you ask Americans, you tell them what they think about the UK right now, they've heard of this paedophile rape gang issue going on. What the hell are you guys doing over there, right? And actually, if that's what it takes, finally, for us to actually face up and help protect the most vulnerable girls in our society, right? Just sheer international embarrassment, then so be it. It's a pity we've fallen this far this fast, but if that's the way we've got to use to get the government and get the machinery of government to actually start working on things that matter to the people, it's better than nothing.
I mean, Trump is taking America in a very different direction now. And do you see that as a positive for Britain?
I think it will be positive compared to perhaps the alternative, purely given that Trump is the most positive American president towards Britain that we've probably ever had. His mother was British. She was born in Scotland, lived there the first couple of decades of her life. There's a lovely shot of Trump. I think he's on the campaign trail. He's sat on an aeroplane, and he's got this book of pictures of him and the royal family. And he's showing the reporter, look, here's me and the Queen. My mum always told me the Queen was an amazing woman. It's one of the few people that he ever talks about in completely glowing terms. And now His Majesty King Charles gets it. I think Prince William got a bit of it as well, the Prince of Wales. So that kind of connection from both him and I think from JD Vance. He's got a lot of friends here. A man called James Orr, who's a philosophy and theology professor at Cambridge, sort of described as one of his kind of Sherpas, his sort of ideological, intellectual inspirations. Talks about how pro the old world of the UK Vance is, and Musk as well. When some people on Twitter in the past have called Elon Musk Afrikaans, he said, no, they're great, but I'm actually English, and uses the word English specifically multiple times to talk about his lineage, because obviously he was born in South Africa. So those, the kind of triumvirate at the top now, we're very lucky, this kind of nostalgic goodwill towards Britain, and are heartbroken, I think, to see what's happening to us. When you've only got to, again, go sit in the Midwest, the American Midwest, and we like to think that the Yanks still think of us as kind of, what they would call tuxedo-wearing spies sipping martinis, or old English gents in tweed and the rest of it. God, I wish that were true. I would hate for these people to come along and see what great swathes of Britain looks like. If people watching this haven't seen it, there's an X account called UK Aesthetics, but it's YOOKAY, and sort of the way, the kind of patois that people talk about UK now. And it's just photograph after photograph after photograph of video of the physical material decline in so many ways of Britain. And I'm scared of the day that the Americans see it, because our tourist industry will crater through the floor when they do.
So we've got Elon Musk is pushing forward with his Doge, his Department of Government Efficiency now, focusing on government waste, etc. I mean, do you think we need a British version of that?
100%. 100%. Look, people have been doing great work on this for kind of 20 odd years now. There's a group called the Taxpayers Alliance who highlight an awful lot of this stuff. I cut my teeth there for several years. It's an amazing place. They do a lot of freedom of information requests of the central government, of local government. And in particular, actually, the local government stuff is great. They don't shy away from those sort of less sexy stories about local council waste, the kind of stuff that really makes people angry. They feel their council tax comes out of their bank account every month, rather than you never feeling it in the kind of PAYE that most people get taxed in. You see that go, and then you see the kind of nonsense that councils waste your money on. Makes people very angry.
There's art collections the councils have. Some of them are enormous, and they don't show them.
Yeah, it's like 1% of these things are actually ever shown, right? Okay, fine, you want to show this stuff, great. If not, sell it on, right? Or put it on display, do something with it. That kind of scrutiny that people like the Taxpayers Alliance have been doing is great, and other think tanks have been doing great work on this as well. What it requires is bravery inside government, right? Because the Blob will always try and hide this stuff. It will always try and minimise it. That's why I think the structure of Doge is actually really exciting, because you've got a bunch of people who have the legal authority in most cases now to go into these different bits of government, and then they're just exposing it, right? They're highlighting all of it the way that a kind of supercharged Taxpayers Alliance might have done in the past, and having it there for all to see. And then if the politicians decide not to do anything about it, well, the voters, the electorate can decide what they think about that. But in most cases, at least, you've got a president as well who wants to get rid of all this stuff. And I think it's no surprise they've started with USAID, the American kind of international development budget. And there's a good argument to be had that some of this stuff is worth it. Can we talk about that soft power idea and all the rest? But the kinds of stuff coming out of there, it's not the quantum so much that matters in this case. It's not the amount of money, but the examples. It's the transgender opera that was being funded by American taxpayers in Chile. There's a transgender comic book somewhere else in South America. The most extraordinary stuff. Stonewall, that was once a kind of very brave leading gay rights charity, that has gone full steam away from that into the kind of transgender, especially for children point, which I think is very, very contentious. They've said very recently they're going to have to get rid of much of half of all of their staff, because half of their staff being funded by the American taxpayer. This stuff is ludicrous, and it's clever to start with that to build up the support for cutting waste, because I think in the American context, only a third of their whole budget is what they would call discretionary spending, and most of that is military. 2/3 of it is what they call Medicare, Medicaid, basically social security, and that's a lot harder to touch, most because Congress has allocated that money, and you'll get senators and congressmen saying, no, you can't get rid of that because I won't get re-elected. Yeah. So they're building support up as they go along by highlighting the more egregious stuff. That would be a great place for us to do it here in the UK as well, because as important as it is to get rid of DEI roles and diversity roles and how corrosive and negative they are inside public sector organisations, that's not going to touch the sides of the big money stuff. And by the way, if growth in the UK was going like the clappers, it would still be really important to get rid of all of this stuff, because I think it's corrosive, it's still a waste of money. But we've got almost no growth at all, right? The most recent figure's 0.1%, but actually the population has grown by 0.2%. So in a kind of what you call per capita basis, we're in a kind of personal recession, actually. Things are getting worse for people here in the UK.
It seems the plan is higher taxation leading to growth.
Right. Well, as Winston Churchill would say, trying to tax your way to growth is like a man standing in a bucket and trying to pull himself up by the handle, right? It's ludicrous. And I think part of the reason, actually, that Musk has got so involved about this Doge point ahead of the other stuff he could do is the Americans are adding $1 trillion to their national debt every 100 days at this point, right? These are just extraordinary numbers. The Biden lot completely lost control of spending and of borrowing, and they're getting to a point where now they spend more on debt interest payments, not paying that debt down, but just on servicing that debt every year, for the first time they do on defence. I think this is known as Ferguson's Law. When this happens, you're not going to survive for long. Of course, in Europe, we've been doing that for years and years anyway, and not spending enough on our defence. So this is getting to a crunch point, because a lot of that debt is owned by people who we maybe don't want to have that level of power over us, the Chinese and various other kind of foreign banks and things like that. But if the American economy were to default in some way, imagine the kind of catastrophe that would happen there. If the UK were to default on this, as we sort of started to see a little bit with Liz Truss's budget, which perhaps we can talk about the mini budget there, the bond market saying, actually, you're not talking how you're going to fund any of this. And actually, in a similar way, Rachel Reeves is doing that just more slowly. Right? There's a huge problem we've got there. And it's not been sexy to talk about debt or deficit since the sort of fake austerity of the Cameron Osborne years. Now, this is big stake stuff, but because it's not a big one exciting explosion, people aren't concerned about it. But if we run out of the ability to borrow money, we run out of the ability to actually finance anything, as we're getting to, and don't forget population here is getting older faster as well, that makes more obligations to come along. We are in a point where, to go to your first question, we could be looking at the UK, other European countries, even America, being failed states if we don't have serious leadership to grasp these issues.
Yeah, I mean, we had John Moynihan on talking about his book Return to Growth.
Brilliant.
He was saying, I think it was the third biggest item is repayment of debt. You don't receive anything.
Right. It's absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? And when you realise that if you didn't have that, what you could spend all of that money on. You could be rebuilding roads, rebuilding hospitals. Better yet, you could be leaving it in people's pockets, because individuals, families, businesses tend to spend their money better than the state ever can. And there's a lot of blame to go around for this. Unfortunately, I think a lot of it goes back to someone like George W. Bush, who in the good times was borrowing lots, spending lots on foreign wars and things like that. The Clinton administration, because it had kept to the Reagan Bush 1, or was it original Bush, I think Trump once called him, kept to their kind of spending constraints, the US was on course to have absolutely no debt by 2008. Had that have happened, could you imagine what that would have looked like? It just feels like another world away. You have people thinking, what do we start doing? Do we start giving people rebates? Do we start, abolishing income tax? All sorts of things would have been possible. And instead, it was supposed to be Conservatives who went completely the other direction. And here in the UK, Blair and Brown did that as well. Massive deficits while the good times were rolling, and not looking at that kind of massive financial crash that happened. This is not serious leadership. Can't imagine this happening. After the Napoleonic Wars, after World War I, World War II, we had similar debt levels, but we didn't have this kind of profligacy. We worked out how to get that debt down again. And this time we've just let it go, and Robert Jenrick, I think, described it as spaffing this money away. And what have we got to show for it? Naff all.
So you were a special advisor to the government. I wanted to get your insight into the Blob and the kind of the government departments and how we could cut some of that and what benefits it would bring.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that if people take one thing away from anything I say, it's the scale of the, you want to call it the administrative state, the deep state, the blob, any of these sorts of things, the kind of big central public sector. It's the size of that relative to the size of the politicians. So when people talk about the Tories did this, the Tories did that, or Labour are doing this, okay, when Keir Starmer became Prime Minister last July, how many people changed jobs across the whole of the British state at the start? It was 200 people, right? 100 ministers changed jobs, right? So 100 Tory ministers, whether you're in the cabinet or in other roles, road minister, health minister, trees minister, all that sort of stuff. And then 100 of their special advisors, people like me, the kind of political appointees who count in some ways as civil servants, but only temporary civil servants. We count as senior civil service for everything other than the pay bands, so we're not paid nearly as well. And you have some of the worst kind of job security in Britain. Your boss gets done in a scandal, you're done too. It's fine, that's part of the game. You've also got no executive authority as a special advisor. You're not allowed to boss around civil servants or give them commands without a very specific thing happening that I think Alistair Campbell had under Blair and almost nobody else did. So your only power is in reading stuff and in giving advice to the Secretary of State who runs that department, the Education Secretary, the Health Secretary or whatever.
Can I just ask before we move on, the 200 people, how many people on the flip side would have kept their job?
Well, almost everybody across the whole civil service.
Thousands?
Tens of thousands, 100,000 or something like that. And this is the big difference between, let's say, the American system. You have the victory happens in early November, then they've got this sort of 3 month or whatever it is, almost 3 month transition period, and you've got a team whose job it is to start filling different posts across all different executive departments and things like that, right? And the Senate has to confirm some of these people. And you hear these kind of hearings where they're asked all sorts of stuff, whether it's Treasury Secretary or whatever else. But the president gets to choose that. They have several months in which to do it. The background work is being done. There was all this stuff about Project 2025, which was this initiative from an American conservative think tank called the Heritage Foundation that was saying, right, we need to get people who believe in this stuff, put your hand up and say, I'm going to go to Washington and I'm going to do this great stuff. And they compiled lists of tens of thousands of people who had the skills and the qualifications and the right kind of ideology to go into those roles and to fill them. Here in the UK, absolutely nothing like that at all. And it'd only be a handful of people anyway, right? 200 people or so change jobs.
So we changed the icing on the cake, basically.
That's it. And some of that icing is so frothy anyway that it almost, to ruin the metaphor, sort of dissolves on the tongue, right? If you've got no actual power. And, can you imagine a private sector organisation, right? You say, congratulations, you've been made CEO of this big bank or whatever it is. You're allowed to hire and fire 3 people around you. You're not allowed to hire the chief operational officer or the chief finance guy or the chief marketing person. Nobody else at all. You're not allowed to really hire and fire your own secretaries or the people keeping your diary, particularly, without kicking up a big stink. You're not allowed to make all kinds of HR decisions. You're not allowed to set your own salaries for people. You're not allowed to do all these kinds of things. No. That's all done by the permanent secretary of each department and then a whole cadre of other people filtering all the way down. So when I was in the Department for Education, there were 4 special advisors in the whole department. That was actually quite a big number. Often it's just 2. And there were 5 or 6 ministers. In the British system, for people watching internationally, we have a fusion of legislature and executive. So these people are also MPs. So one day out of the 5 working days, they go back to their constituency and they do that important work. If Mrs. Miggin's tree falls over in the garden, you've got to help them, and the really important stuff like that. I don't want to make light of that. That's really important. So they're there for 4 days. And you've got 5 or 6 ministers, 6 special advisors. There were about 10 of us who were political appointees who were there to try and deliver the kind of ideological beliefs of that Conservative government.
Right.
And 8,000 or so civil servants inside it, none of whom we were able to get rid of, none of whom we were allowed to reprimand, none of whom we were allowed to move about or anything like that. And they would control all kinds of things. And of course, if there's only a few of you, you can't even find out what most of these people are doing. It took me 10 months or so of trying to get an organogram to see all the different teams, and that was almost impossible to get out of these guys. There were teams who were still working on various priorities of previous education secretaries that had been long cut from any kind of actual political interest. Probably had happened even before the last general election and the new manifesto that had come in. But it was a nice cushy job. Obviously, lots of these people were not coming into the office. They'd be dialing in on calls. And it's like quite a nice, big kitchen you've got there in sort of leafy Surrey or somewhere. We've seen the same thing happen in America with these big federal buildings all empty. Businesses want to do that, by the way. That's fine. I think we've got a responsibility as people inside government to train up the next generation of civil servants, right? So that's why I think it was important to get people back into departments. But that's the kind of mismatch you've got here, how difficult it therefore is to ever get anything done. And that's before we talk about regulators, talk about arm's length bodies or quangos or any of that kind of stuff that makes it even more difficult. We can talk about that as well.
My basic take on this is, well, what's the point in voting for someone if they're this and then there's all of this underneath that they can't do anything about?
Yeah, exactly right. This should make people furious, right? And this is why when you see the different prime minister comes in and out and these different teams and stuff, why not as much changes as you would hope that it might. At least in America, you do see these big veers in different directions. That people say, well, that's really inefficient. I think that's course correction, right? Trump came in and was very hawkish on China. Democrats didn't change any of that. Hawkish on certain tariff things. Actually, Biden didn't change any of that. So there were some bipartisan issues there, but you were able to kind of course correct. They went too far on the DEI stuff. Maybe they went too far on the net zero stuff. There's a course correction. If it's been corrected too far the other way, you'll get a feedback mechanism in the election. You get to go the other way. And at least you've got people who's got skin in the game in all of those key roles. They really believe in it, and they'll sink or swim based on that. Here, if things go wrong, the only people that get fired are the ministers at the very top. Maybe a naughty special advisor every now and then for getting caught leaking something. Right? But it's almost impossible to be fired from the civil service. You just get moved on to a different job, probably promoted into a different role. The rationale for this is supposed to be that it's a Rolls-Royce civil service and it's brilliant and it gets everything done and it's totally neutral and non-partisan and unbiased and all this stuff. But it's made up of people, like any business is. Everybody's biased to some extent. There are a few people who just like the kind of mechanisms of it and are able to kind of park their beliefs at the door. But in my experience, actually, quite few in number are actually like that. And I wouldn't expect people to be that non-partisan. I want people who really have skin in the game because they will be then delighting in their successes, and if they fail, they'll fall on their sword honourably. And I think that this problem is one of the 2 or 3 main reasons why everything is so bad in the UK now. You know, there are only a tiny number of people who have to leave on the Friday to go back to their constituency and hear what's going on. They'll start feeding some of this stuff back, and the blob will find ways to resist it. One of the other big reasons, of course, is that people inside Parliament are so willing in recent years and decades to vote to give away Parliament's power itself to unelected regulators, to unelected quangos and ALBs. And I'll put my hands up for my party and say, actually, this is one of the few things that Mrs. Thatcher got wrong. She thought that she would be able to take this stuff out of the civil service, full of wets, as she would have called them, put them into these things, and they wouldn't be so left-wing as anyone else, because they'd be independent, they'd be better. They've been captured just like everything else has. And yet, when you're the education secretary or whoever else, you go to pull one of these levers, nothing happens. SPADs are sent down, special advisors sent down to find out where this lever isn't connected anymore. And actually it turns out it's a regulator, it's a quango, it's a something else, it's legislation that says you can't do this, it's the ECHR that says you can't do this, and all this stuff. And so we have willingly frittered away our power, it's judges, frittered away our power, so that actually you haven't got an awful lot of room for manoeuvre anymore. It's almost like... people have ever played the video game Tetris. You have to move the different shapes up, and as you kind of mess up and you leave gaps, the blocks build up, and you find you have less and less room for manoeuvre.
Faster and faster.
Right, and that's kind of where we're at now. You haven't got the Prime Minister is the only person who can come along and call one of those long blocks to come down to try and clear some of the way. Prime Minister has so much power bottlenecked up. And yet, as people like Dominic Cummings have said, spend a huge amount of their time on stuff they shouldn't be, on kind of media and on like visiting nice venues and all that kind of stuff and doing photo ops and all that kind of stuff. Everybody else have their hands tied. So even if you're trying to get stuff done, the system is designed to treat you like a virus for which they are antibodies. And that's why you can't ever get anything done. And of course, the last thing I'll say on it is that then the Labour lot come in, and they genuinely, I think, believed their own rhetoric, let's say, thinking, well, when the evil Tories are out, it'll all be fine again. And they're realising, oh my God, no, that's not true. It's really hard to do this. I'm not allowed to get any of this stuff done. And the people who are actually in charge, the civil servants, the quangos, the regulators, the judges, increasingly, all this stuff, people inside the ECHR and other foreign courts, they have the power. And these guys are like, oh my God, I can't actually do anything. I can't get anything done. And all the same bad stuff is happening. And because I can't even find the team inside my own department who's pumping this stuff out until it's too late and I've got to issue a correction or try and fix it or something. It's maddening. The hope is that Labour clock this much more quickly than the Tories never did. We never got on top of this, despite some of us trying, with the exception of that period where Dominic Cummings was sort of in charge of things. And I have to say, my own biases here, I kind of agree with Dominic Cummings' diagnosis and prescription for basically all the ills of the state, and his blog is a good place to read some of the more egregious examples of this, and the solutions. The solutions are, you have to, I think, abolish huge swathes of these arm's-length bodies, of the quangos. Any charity that gets all its money straight from the government isn't a real charity. Get rid of a lot of the regulators, or at least shrink them, or at least tell them they've also got to have a due responsibility for growth and take away some of those sorts of issues. Get all the ECHR stuff and foreign judges and courts out of our statute books. It's not as simple as just doing one thing, but you've got to take it out of this bit of legislation and that bit of legislation. A Great Repeal Act, get rid of all of that stuff and put the power back in the hands of the directly elected ministers. So when something goes wrong and they pull that metaphorical lever, something happens. And it may be for good or ill, but at least they will sink or swim on their own ideas and their own abilities. We'll be able to see that, and then there'll be a real, proper, demonstrable choice at whatever the next election coming up is, for there to be a course correction there. And that might even attract good, higher quality people to come back into government. Because at the moment, why do you need to have high quality people as ministers when the civil service does all the work for you anyway? All you actually need is someone who is willing to go on the TV and say the lines that they're given.
Yeah. So why was there such a willingness to give all the power to these various kind of quangos, NGOs, etc.?
There's all kinds of, I suspect, PhD level theses to be written about all of this stuff. I think the bit of cod analysis of this is that as the media got more powerful in 24-hour news and all this kind of stuff, and the pay got worse, the conditions for somebody being a minister were just much less pleasant, right? Who wants to have some journalist literally rifling through their bins, poking their nose into every terrible thing you've ever said or done or whatever else, calling you out on it? All your mates, if you're halfway talented, are earning squillions more. Well, I was going to say in the city, probably in America now, or in the UAE or somewhere like that, where there's less crime and more sunshine and things. Why would you go and do that? So people instead are increasingly just moving into their walled gardens, working at startups, working in big firms, getting stuff done where they've actually got that freedom of manoeuvre. The people who are left are terrified by this awesome power that is their inheritance and their responsibility, of an actually sovereign parliament. They're scared by it. And therefore, they hear the kind of siren song of people saying, don't worry, Minister, we'll sort it for you. And this legislation will get an independent regulator, and it can be their job to worry about all of these things. So you can focus on what really matters, which is either getting elected or just being able to see their face on the telly a few more times. And so that becomes, I think, a kind of a toxic doom loop, where lower quality begats lower quality, power is frittered more and more away, and you end up with a parliament that is not so much sovereign as basically completely Potemkin at this point. Now, that's the downside of our system, where despite some idiot journalists who have watched too much of the West Wing, we've got no separation of powers here, right? Until the Supreme Court came along, which I think one of those other things we should get rid of, by the way, that even the highest court in the land was inside Parliament and the executive drawn from Parliament. So if you have a really powerful sovereign Parliament, you've got a kind of elected dictatorship for every 4 or 5 years before there's a change, but at least you can respond rapidly and quickly to things that are happening. And the American system obviously is designed differently. But when you therefore get this kind of terrible infestation as we've got inside Whitehall now, I think the results are turbocharged, which is why we're not able to course correct, and we've seen a continual rot, whereas America has been able to reinvent itself several times now.
You outlined the steps to a solution. I mean, how realistic is that, and what kind of person will we need to actually make that happen?
Yeah, the crown is laying in the gutter, and who will stoop to pick it up, right? Yeah. It's a great question. I think that you've got... So Kemi Badenoch talks a good game about this. She's an engineer and needing to rewire the state and all that sort of stuff. I think that's right to some extent, but it needs to be done right off the bat. The planning work needs to be done well in advance, because whoever wins that next election will have to come in on day one and say, right, this is the plan. Here's an emergency bill that just scraps all of this stuff, cuts off funding for all of this stuff. And it may be chaotic, like we're seeing to some extent in America with Doge getting up and running and these big changes, but that's what's necessary. Can Kemi do it? I think it's a big question. She is at least talking about taking time to work through some of that stuff. Her difficulty is that you've got another party of the right snapping at heels and actually leading in all the polls at the moment. I don't know enough about Reform's plans overall to see if they are on the same wavelength for this. And there's one MP, they've got a chap called Rupert Lowe, who talks a lot about this, talks about kind of repealing all of this stuff in one fell swoop. He's a businessman, so he understands it. So you've got these guys are getting towards the right answer. You've even got people in the Labour Party, and I can't be found about to praise them in any way, shape or form, because they've been pretty uniformly dreadful, I think, since this government, and I would say basically every other Labour government. But they're starting to get this stuff a lot faster than the Conservatives ever did, realising none of this stuff works. Right, and they're starting to talk about the need to cut the huge welfare bill. They're starting to understand they don't have the power they need, firing people in the kind of big regulators for not giving them good enough ideas on growth. Obviously mad that they're asking regulators for ideas on how to get growth going. But they are even getting towards this. I fear that, as Adam Smith said, there's plenty of ruin in a nation, that things are going to get at least a little bit worse, if not significantly worse, before they start to get any better. And if that happens, people's material well-being continues to decrease. We keep not addressing this other massive elephant in the room that is the kind of cultural effects of mass migration that we've seen increasingly, but perhaps we can discuss as well. Things are going to get much worse, and you might get to a point where you almost need a kind of not need, but you will end up seeing there being increasing actual tension. I've read some people who actually genuinely think that civil wars are coming down the track. Now, I really hope that's not the case. I hope that is really far-fetched silliness. But when you realise how many more people have come into this country illegally on small boats, all of kind of fighting age in the last few years, than there are members of the British Army, you start to get a bit worried about these things, right? You start to get a bit worried that we don't have any resources to deal with this. We don't know who's coming into the country. You've got increasing numbers of people, when polled, said they wouldn't even fight for this country if there were a war. Let alone people who hate seemingly this country so much, both people who were not born here and people who were. They don't care for it at all. You could get to a point where things collapse first slowly and then all at once. And given that the solution is so simple, right, just elect 300 odd people into Parliament who will smash all this nonsense up, let businesses get growing again, and clamp down on law and order, and chuck everybody who's been breaking laws into prison for a long time and not let them out. Look at El Salvador. It's gone from the most dangerous place in the world to the safest place in the Western Hemisphere. The solution is in some ways so easy, and yet we seem not to be doing it. It speaks to me that there is a deep, deep sickness, and I've seen chunks of it inside government, and you see more chunks of it every time you walk down the street now, and it's deeply upsetting.
If someone did go ahead with a plan like this, the thousands and thousands of people that we've talked about in the Blob or whatever, they're not going to like it. This person's going to be deeply unpopular.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
It's not going to be an easy job at all.
No, which is why people haven't done it, right? As the ability of this Blob have kind of gone through, they have retained kind of control for so long, with again a few small periods, that this, I don't want to say about the people in that system, but the system itself, right? It almost does work as a sort of body and has antibodies in it. There's some of the most amazing, talented people I've ever met have been people that I've worked with inside the civil service. When I was in the Treasury, when I was in the Cabinet Office, those are some super talented people who are frankly keeping the show on the road and keeping the lights on. And they're suffering under this terrible system as well, right? They see jumped up people over-promoted, older than them. They then get disenchanted, I think is probably the best way to put it, by that system. They choose to leave and go and do something else with their lives because they've seen how futile it is to try and change it. And they do a good job actually of stopping a lot of the stupid stuff that the low-grade elected politicians that we've had do. So there's a sort of almost sweet spot where you've got to kind of not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
My old boss, a guy called Nadim Zahawi, who was very successful in business, then he did the vaccine rollout, and then lots of other government jobs in cabinet and things like that. And he brought a kind of private sector experience, all kinds of mad stories where in the vaccine rollout, they were talking about recreating a whole logistics supply chain at moving this stuff around. And he said to them, okay, how much experience have you guys got of moving stuff at scale at sub-zero temperatures? Well, we don't have any of that. Okay. How much experience have you got of moving anything at sub-zero temperature? Well, no, I don't think we have that either. But he said, okay, how much experience have you got of moving anything from anywhere to anywhere? Well, we don't have that. He said, okay. Have you ever heard about DHL? Have you ever heard about supply chain industries? Like, oh yeah, I guess we could ask them. That kind of madness. So that's the sort of stuff that we're fighting against. The system itself will hate that, and it will try to resist it at every turn, because either it thinks it knows best and it sees business and making profits as a nasty, dirty thing, and these people as inherently exploitative, rather than seeing business as something you should learn from and work with. And I think there's just a general level of almost arrogance of we know best. And as things are sinking ever more into the sea almost, as long as they're the kind of people left at the top of it, maybe that's too mean. But you're definitely right in that there is going to be such a horrendous resistance to this. So unless anybody has a fully thought through plan, on day one, they're going to flounder. Because even if what you actually want to do is fix the debt problem we've talked about, you want to fix the kind of defence problem we've talked about, you want to fix healthcare in this country, you want to fix the potholes, all of that stuff. If you don't have an ability to make the government apparatus work for you, you're not going to get anything done. And don't listen to the siren song of some people, even some people I quite like in my party and others, who say, no, it's fine. You just need to, work the civil service in the right way, right? As long as you cajole them and praise them in the same way. No. That is no way to run a serious, sensible, modern government. You need to have a slick system that works, because we haven't even started talking about how much AI and all these new techs are going to change absolutely everything. So there's a huge set of problems in there, and I don't want to depress people, but it is pretty serious. And if we don't do this, you're going to see the further breakdown of law and order. You're going to see people's living standards get even lower. You're going to see, weirdly, somehow house prices still getting higher. Because even if some politicians kind of get these things, the feedback mechanism that's supposed to be them seeing it, talking to ministers, and ministers acting on it, is broken because it gets slowed down and stymied by this. The one time we've done something well in this country recently on that vaccine rollout is by throwing out all the nonsense rules because we realised that it was a crisis. Every other crisis is that is the frog in the boiling pot of water that doesn't realise it yet. That's where we are right now.
Yeah. You mentioned the cultural changes coming about from immigration and stuff. I wanted to explore that a bit with you as well.
If I haven't depressed everybody thoroughly enough by now. Well, I think that you see in those numbers, to start with this, the numbers about people who said they wouldn't fight for this country anymore. Now, some of that are people just being kind of trendy lefties who say the UK sucks because they've been told for ages now that we are the most uniquely racist, sexist, transphobic country in the world. They've never been taught the fact that it was this island that was the first in all of history to actively fight against the slave trade. So there's all that kind of cultural Marxist rot that they've been taught. That's part of it. But lots of people who genuinely, and Kemi Badenoch, to her credit, has spoken about this, because of technology, they feel more affinity to places where either they or their parents or even grandparents have come from than they do to this country, because we've not been standing up for our kind of ways of life. And there's a lot of talk nowadays about kind of British values. I think that's pretty amorphous. I think that's sort of stuff we've only been talking about at all really for the last kind of 35 years or so. Before that, we hadn't really needed to, partly because the kind of Anglo victory, both in the Cold War and before that in the Second World War, meant that our broad values and beliefs and ways of doing things had become a sort of universal standard. Yeah. A sort of British Anglo way, American way of doing things mixed with kind of Christian morality. Basically, it was what written, the kind of UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights and that sort of thing. But going back even further than that, because most people have been quite settled on this island or these islands for quite a long time, the ways of life about doing things have been passed down. Not just like sitting in a classroom and being told, this is how you make a cup of tea, this is how you do that. You imbibe this stuff, you just breathe it in by watching your mum and dad do it, by watching your grandparents do it, by watching everybody else in the village do it, everyone in the church, or increasingly since what Cromwell let them in the synagogue, and all these sorts of things. And so that was a thing that was passed down. And it's been the envy of the world. And every time it's been replicated in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand, to some extent in America, Singapore, that Lee Kuan Yew, and probably the most amazing leader of the 20th century, came to England, studied, sadly, at Cambridge, and he saw that you can buy a newspaper and leave the penny or whatever it was in a little box there and take a paper, and no one's there to watch you. And this system works, and someone doesn't just come along and nick all of it. How did you create this amazing society that allows you to do this? This is incredible. He went back to Singapore and he decided to recreate it. He recreated it in a jungle, basically, an island jungle that was too hot to do anything almost, and didn't have any real resources other than a nice-looking bay, and turned it into a first-world country that is the safest city on earth. You now take your phone and your wallet and you leave it as a placeholder on a table when you go out to get food. As a Brit, you think, hang on a minute, that's going to get snatched even if it's in my hand, and yet they're able to do that. And they've taken all of that kind of stuff at exactly the same time that we've lost so much of this. And some people want to blame it on Islam, and I think there are interesting conversations about bits of Islamic theology, jurisprudence, or the rest of it that I do think are increasingly incompatible with the West. The school near me, where the dress code, the school uniform, is for 8-year-old girls to be forced to wear hijabs, headscarves, from 8 years old, right? I don't think that's a terribly good way to order a society, to say in Britain in 2025 that an 8-year-old girl is never allowed to feel the wind in her hair when she's running around a playground in England, right? I think that there's conversations to be had about the cruelty around making halal food, right? I think it's a particularly cruel way of slaughtering an animal. But these are sort of low status beliefs that we don't want to have arguments about, either because we'll be looked down upon by kind of cultural elites, or on the threat of violence from certain members of certain communities who will attack you for this.
Also, we're British and we don't like to moan about stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, even that, I think, to an extent, we didn't mind moaning about these things before the Second World War, right? There's the classic story, so not limited to Islam, but in India, where there was a tradition called suti, where if a man died, his wife would be burned alongside him, right? So the village wouldn't have to do it. And I can't remember the person's name, but the sort of general who was out there running this bit of India, rights and wrongs of the empire and all that aside. So interesting, that's your cultural practice. Well, my cultural practice from Britain is that if you burn a woman alive who's innocent, you get hanged for it. So if you want to go and carry out your cultural practice, I'll do mine afterwards. And stopped it, right? So we didn't mind feeling that we were confident there, that our tradition of not burning innocent women alive was pretty good, right? We didn't mind it in the past there. And I wonder if your reaction, which I agreed with until very recently, is what the kids would call cope these days in the face of our increasing kind of cultural lack of confidence about things. Kemi Badenoch got attacked recently for saying that some cultures are better than others. Of course, some cultures are better than others, right? There are cultures where women aren't allowed to leave the house. They're not allowed to learn to read. They have to wear, heavy sack coverings that cover not just their hair, but all of their bodies. They have their private parts sewn up until their wedding day. They have their clitorises chopped off. Obviously, these things are terrible things. We don't prosecute them as much as we should here. We've allowed it to happen. So there's a big problem there. But even if it's not a kind of religious problem, having so many people from other different ways of life coming here and not having to assimilate or integrate to just our ways of doing things, which I think we all think are pretty good and have been adapted for a long time, is a negative impact. When a few people come, as has been happening for a long time, and they integrate, the results you get out of it are wonderful people like Rishi Sunak, who's as English as anybody else, not ethnically but nationally, not just British but English. He's kind of painfully English. You look at Rishi, right? The way he loves a failing football team, the way he loves cricket, the way he's always seen with a cup of tea, all that kind of stuff, right? And fundamentally his values. He may not be a Christian, but his brand of religion, it seems, is very compatible with the ways that people have been doing things here for a long time. You get great things like that. But in recent years, with the levels of immigration going as they are, you've seen a kind of cultural deterioration. And even if loads of these people, if they're all Shakespeare, which I don't think they are, having these sort of separate worlds growing up around us is just a negative thing for a society to have. And that has only sped up in the last few years with this so-called Boris wave of just extraordinary numbers of people coming. And no longer is it Christian Poles or Australian barmaids or whatever the other stereotypes are. Lots of Italians and Spaniards coming over because they had high youth unemployment. So now people from all over the world whose views on life are very, very, very different. Even if we weren't bringing lots of terrorists and people like that over, which we are because we're seeing all kinds of attacks happening across Europe in the wake of the ISIS caliphate and all that sort of stuff. Just very different ways of doing things. And that's not really surprising, right? If you've got lots of people come over who have, at the core, a fundamental difference in belief of the metaphysics of reality, right? That if God says this, you just got to do it. And if I thought that God wanted me to do X, Y, or Z, that would be more important for me, perhaps, than the law of the land. But we've grown up in a tradition of Christianity that says render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and you kind of muddle along, and you can have that divide of the secular and the religious, and that's all fine. But if people don't have that, and they start acting in these ways in secular spaces, you're obviously going to have problems, no matter what the religious teachings are. But again, these are low-status beliefs. This will get me a load of hate. Might even get you some hate for putting some of this stuff out there anyway. And therefore people would rather, as you said, be a bit more English about it, not want to talk about it, keep your head down, hope things are getting better. But the scale of change that we're seeing, there isn't going to be the kind of England that you remember in certain cities very soon, in certain key ways. And I, for one, think that this has been the greatest culture that the world has ever seen. We've created the Americans and the Aussies and all the rest. We have a huge contribution still to make on top of the one we've already made, but we've lost our complete cultural confidence in ourselves. The demographic problems of people not having babies is making things much worse. And we're not even trying to say to people who are coming here and living largely off welfare, hey, have you thought about learning English? Right? I'll stop with this example, but a man decided to burn a Quran outside the Turkish consulate in London.
Yeah.
Not a very nice thing to do, but he should be allowed to do it under, I think, freedom of speech. Chap comes out and says, "I'll kill you," and starts trying to stab him, right? He gets arrested, released on bail. The chap who did the offence was remanded into custody, and just to really complete it, a Deliveroo driver came past and started kicking the Quran burner in the head whilst he was down anyway, just for good measure, right? The BBC described the knife attacker as being from Derby, and yet he entered his not guilty plea via a translator. Do people from Derby, actually from Derby, not speak English anymore? No, right. So we know that there is a kind of a deep rot going on here, and that story I think is emblematic for so many of these sorts of problems, because we don't really have the language to talk about this stuff very comfortably. Again, we're just ignoring it and watching that problem pile up, as we're watching the debt problem pile up, as we're watching the governance crisis pile up, as we're watching the weakness in our defence piling up. And to answer your first question, at some point when the issues all come to the fore, we've got a failed state on our hands, and life is going to get very, very unpleasant for people. Certainly people who don't have a green card, perhaps coming down the road with an American fiance, and the idea that there's a parachute to run away. If you're stuck here, things are going to get pretty nasty.
So what's the solution?
Don't despair just yet. Because if you do, I think people would just all get up and leave, which we are seeing, by the way, right? The UK is set to lose more millionaires than any other country in the world over the course of this parliament. Not just people with big houses, but actual liquid millionaires, and they're all fleeing. People who want to have a safer life, they're fleeing again. That's pretty bad. We've got to try and stop that. I think the solution has to be that government of the right, whatever that looks like, has to be elected and soonish, who doesn't care about elite's high status opinion, has a plan a bit like what we've talked about, that, in the words of Javier Milei, just afueras great loads of this stuff all in one go, and that we have to then start being more robust on our values and our ways of life, and only having people here who love this place. Roger Scruton would call oikophilia, a love of place. If you don't have that, then you can't stay. And that starts with deportations of people. And increasingly, I think we're going to have to start having really unpleasant, illiberal conversations, certainly illiberal to today's soft mindset, about what that entails in order to keep ourselves safer. And that's happening right across Europe as well. Sweden is the canary in the coal mine on this. Yeah. They talked a big game about being a superpower for humanitarian issues and things like that. How's that worked out? They have a grenade attack almost every day, horrendous crime, all the rest of it going on. And they're now paying people who haven't assimilated to leave. They're talking about taking passports off people as well. And this idea of what being Swedish actually is it just having a passport, or is it adapting to these different ways of life? Of course, that's really hard to do, right? You're going to go test somebody every now and then on whether they've learned ABBA songs, or whether all their furniture's from IKEA or any of that silly stuff. No, it's really hard to do. But the alternative is that you end up in a system in the UK where you have a sort of balkanisation of things, right? Things are really, really unsafe, and you have to increasingly to just kind of kowtow to these different ways of life. A Five Guys burger restaurant in Birmingham that stopped selling non-halal meat and stopped selling alcohol. That kind of stuff will happen. You might say, well, that's just capitalism. I thought you were a big free marketeer. And this is the other problem, that a lot of our deeply held, small l, liberal values have been used and are being used and will be used against us as time goes on. Talk about freedom of speech. People wanted to say disgusting things like, the West is terrible or whatever. Freedom of assembly. We're just out here on this main road, holding it up, praying. What's the problem with that? Don't you believe in freedom of expression for, and so on and so on. And we're going to have to, I think, I'm afraid, get and clamp down on this stuff. And it's not just an Islamist issue of getting rid of people who hold those fundamentally different beliefs that are incompatible with the ways that we live about these things. But I think the state's going to have to get, and ironically, given I've said how rubbish the state is in so many ways, you're probably going to see, if in order to keep some of these traditions alive, more state infringement, at least for a little bit, because things have got so bad. How many people watching this have been blighted by some, insert expletive here, getting onto a train and playing loud music on the train or the bus or the tube or whatever, and you're scared to tell them to turn it off, and rightly so. A couple of years ago, someone did this. He brought like a big boombox thing on, not just a phone. Someone said, turn it off, and the guy screamed, do you want to die? and they got into a fight. Police came along, broke it up. Fortunately, some off-duty police officers. But they get onto the concourse, and this bloke pulls a horseshoe out of his bag and kills someone with it for asking him to turn the music down. Right? I'm at the point where I'm saying, no, I think that actually if someone does that, there's a custodial sentence in it. Right? I'm sorry, pour encourager les autres, to encourage the others, we have to go through a period of deep illiberalisation of policing public spaces and things like that in order to get us to a safer and happier place again. And I think a lot of that is going to involve custodial sentences as the best way to do it. And that's going to be an awful lot more people being locked up for an awfully long time than I'd be comfortable with. But we've got to a point where there are so many people here who are unpleasant that they need locking up to keep the rest of us safe. And I think a return, ironically, to someone like Theresa May's hostile environment, where we cut down enormously on any benefits. If you don't speak English, you can't stay here. Really, really unpleasant things like that I would much rather we didn't do. Banning cousin marriages. We've never had to ban cousin marriages because it's never been a big issue. But you now have places where consanguineous marriage results in babies born with horrendous birth defects. And beyond that, the reason that cousin marriages are bad is because they tend to create tribal alliances in areas where that happens. We've never had that here, which has made it easier for us to all be kind of one nation. Right? It's mad that we're talking about having to ban this kind of stuff, but I think that is the end point because we haven't even tried to assimilate people. And now it's at a point where even if we started trying to do gentle things like teaching lovely nebulous British values more in school, or let's all have a cup of tea and a game of cricket and all that kind of silly twee stuff, I fear we're too far gone for that. You look around some of these major cities, I think we're too far gone. And that is heartbreaking. And people who allowed us to get to this state should be held to account. But that is a secondary order issue, I think, from getting in a government that understands how late the hour is and how serious we need to do this. Because if we don't do it in the next few years, things get worse, the level of course correction that's required is going to be even more unpleasant. And I really don't want to be around for that.
James Price, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.